Welcome to Neural Nexus Podcast, where we explore the hottest topics shaping the world. Let's dive in.
All right, let's jump right in, folks. We're talking some wild weather today, and it's headed straight for Texas and Louisiana. I mean, winter has been all kinds of unpredictable this year, right? But it sounds like the South is about to get a taste of some seriously frigid temps. And that might not be a good thing for everyone.
Yeah, it is kind of remarkable how quickly things can change, isn't it? Like 1 minute it's mild, and the next, bam, the National Weather Service is putting out freeze warnings.
You got that right. It kind of makes you wonder, what exactly makes a regular cold snap suddenly turn into something the NWS considers a serious threat? What's the trigger for those warnings?
Well, they don't issue a freeze warning lightly, I'll tell you that. Basically, it means they're forecasting some seriously widespread, significant freezing temperatures. And honestly, that wording kind of jumps out at me. Significant, widespread. This isn't just, a little dip in the thermometer. We're talking about temps that could really impact folks, infrastructure, agriculture, you name it.
Got it. So significant and widespread are the key words here. And when I look at the map, it seems like there are some major cities right in the path of this thing.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking Houston, Galveston in Texas. Even stretching over to parts of Louisiana, they're all getting ready for this crazy temperature swing.
Houston and Galveston, those places aren't exactly known for their winter wonderlands, right? This could really shake things up for a lot of people down there. What kind of impact are we talking about here?
You're right. Those cities definitely aren't used to dealing with deep freezes. That's why these warnings are so important. They give people a heads up, some time to prepare. Hopefully, folks can avoid the worst of it. We're talking about potential damage to crops, outdoor plumbing freezing up and bursting. Of course, there's the risk to people, especially those who are, more vulnerable to the cold.
So it's not just about a number on a thermometer, it's about real-world stuff. Okay, let's get down to the details. What's the timeline for Texas? When does this freeze warning actually kick in?
All right, so for Texas, the warning is in effect from midnight tonight until 9 a.m. Central Standard Time on Monday. Temperatures could plummet as low as 28 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas, and, even lower in others.
I was reading that Houston County is bracing for a particularly rough hit. I think they said it could even get down to 22 degrees. Yikes. That's the kind of cold that can do some serious damage. What are the biggest concerns for Texans right now?
Well, like we were saying, there's the potential for widespread damage to crops, which is a massive problem for farmers and agricultural businesses. And then there's the impact on infrastructure, things like exposed pipes. They're super vulnerable in those kind of temps. And we can't forget about the risks to vulnerable populations, right? The elderly, folks experiencing homelessness, anyone without reliable heating. They're all at increased risk during this kind of weather.
Right. It really drives home the point that these warnings aren't just about numbers. It's about real-life impact. So what are the experts recommending people do to get ready?
The National Weather Service has put out some safety recommendations, and everyone in the affected areas should definitely take note. They're saying to be super careful while traveling, especially with icy roads being a real possibility. And obviously, dressing warmly is key. They're also emphasizing pet safety, making sure animals are brought indoors and have somewhere warm to stay.
And doesn't this all sound a bit familiar? I'm getting flashbacks to that 2021 Texas freeze, remember? The one that caused those massive power outages across the whole state. What did Texas learn from that experience, and do you think they're better prepared this time around?
Oh, you're absolutely right to bring that up. 2021 was a real wake-up call for Texas. Heck, for the entire country, really. It showed just how vulnerable our systems can be to this kind of extreme weather. Millions of Texans were left without power. The state's energy grid was pushed to its absolute breaking point. Since then, they've made some improvements, steps to winterize those power plants and improve how energy providers coordinate with each other. But whether it's enough to prevent another crisis like that, well, I guess this freeze will be the real test.
So Texas has a few tough days ahead, for sure. But we can't forget about Louisiana, right? They're also under a freeze warning. How are things shaping up over there? Is it similar to what Texas is facing?
Well, Louisiana's freeze warning isn't quite as long. It's from 3 a.m. to 10 a.m. Central Standard Time on Monday. And while the temperatures might not dip as low as in Texas, that 28 to 32 degree range is still pretty serious.
Yeah, especially when you consider they've also got a wind advisory going on top of that freeze warning. Plus, I think I read that there's a chance of power outages because of falling tree limbs. It sounds like Louisiana is getting hit with a whole bunch of winter woes at once.
You said it. That combo of freezing temperatures, strong winds, and the possibility of power outages, it creates a pretty dicey situation. And don't forget about the health risks that come with these conditions. Things like frostbite and hypothermia, they become a very real concern, especially for anyone who's exposed to the elements for too long.
So it sounds like Louisiana needs to be just as ready as Texas for this sudden cold snap. All right, we've talked about the local impacts in both states, but let's zoom out a bit. We've been hearing a lot about Winter Storm Blair and something called the polar vortex. Can
Mhm.
you help connect the dots here? What are we actually dealing with?
Sure, think of Winter Storm Blair, that's the name the Weather Channel gave it, as the driving force behind this massive cold front that's sweeping across the entire country. And it's not just a southern thing either. We're seeing reports of heavy snow, sleet, freezing rain, and ice, all the way from Kansas to the Ohio Valley and even into the central Appalachians. It's a major weather event with potentially far-reaching consequences.
Wow, so it's impacting a huge chunk of the country. And then there's this polar vortex thing. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. What exactly is it? What role is it playing in all this?
It does sound a bit dramatic, huh? But the polar vortex is a real phenomenon. It's this large area of low pressure and cold air that usually circulates way up north around the Earth's poles. But sometimes this vortex kind of weakens, and that allows some of that frigid Arctic air to escape, to spill southward. And that's exactly what's happening right now.
So it's like the Arctic air is breaking free and heading south for a visit. And that's what's bringing these unusually cold temperatures to places like Texas and Louisiana.
Exactly. And this movement of Arctic air is also contributing to those other winter storms we were just talking about, the ones slamming into the Midwest and Northeast.
Okay, so Winter Storm Blair is the immediate culprit, but the weakened polar vortex is the bigger force behind these extreme temperatures. What kind of overall impact are we looking at from this one-two punch? What are the experts most worried about?
Well, the National Weather Service is predicting some significantly reduced visibility. That means travel could become extremely dangerous. We could be looking at impassable roads, widespread power outages, and potentially millions of people impacted. It's definitely a situation to keep a close eye on and to take very seriously.
Sounds like we need to buckle up for a potentially disruptive few days. But beyond the immediate impacts, this whole situation has gotten me thinking about the bigger picture. What does this freeze tell us about the changing climate? And how prepared are we, really, for these kinds of events in the future?
There's a lot to unpack there. I think that's where we need to head next in our deep dive. Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? This freeze, it's definitely disruptive right now, but it also kind of makes us think about those bigger issues, right? Like, what does this tell us about climate change and how ready are we or not ready for this kind of extreme weather?
I think when a lot of people hear climate change, they picture those, scorching heat waves and the ocean rising and all that. But this freeze kind of shows us that the effects of climate change are a lot more complicated and sometimes even kind of unexpected.
You're totally right. Climate change doesn't just mean things are getting warmer little by little. It means we see more and more of all kinds of extreme weather, heat waves, droughts, floods, and yep, even these crazy cold snaps like what we're seeing now.
And that unpredictability, that's going to make it even harder to prepare, right? It's not just dealing with one steady change. It's like, got to be ready for anything.
Exactly. A lot of our infrastructure, our systems for dealing with disasters, they were designed for a more predictable climate. Now we're facing these challenges that are really pushing those systems to the limit.
So how do we adapt to that? What kind of changes need to happen so we're more resilient when these crazy weather patterns hit?
Well, on a practical level, it means making our infrastructure stronger, right? Things like the power grid, transportation systems, communication networks, all that stuff has got to be able to handle a wider range of conditions than what they were originally built for.
And I guess that also means making sure our homes are ready, right? Like good insulation, making sure we can handle the crazy heat and the extreme cold. It's like
Yeah.
we got to be ready for whatever Mother Nature throws at us.
You got it. We need to start thinking about climate resilience in a much bigger way.
Mm.
And I'm not just talking about physical stuff. It's also about developing early warning systems, getting communities prepared, even setting up financial safety nets to help people recover after climate-related disasters hit.
So it's about individuals being prepared, but it's also about making those bigger changes, system-wide changes to make sure our communities are more resilient as a whole.
Exactly. It's a multifaceted problem that needs solutions at every level: individual, local, national, and even global.
Let's think about this freeze for a sec. I can't help but think about what happened in 2021 in Texas, when that freeze exposed all those weaknesses in their energy grid. Do you think Texas is more prepared this time around?
You're right to bring up 2021. That was a major wake-up call, not just for Texas, but for the whole country, really.
Yeah.
It showed how incredibly important it is to invest in a really strong and resilient energy infrastructure, one that can actually handle these kinds of extreme weather events.
So, have there been any big changes since then to make the grid more reliable? Are we feeling confident that Texas can avoid a repeat of that 2021 mess, with millions of people without power and freezing conditions?
They've made some progress, for sure. The state has taken some steps to winterize some power plants and to improve the coordination between all those different energy providers. But the question is it enough? I guess this freeze is going to be the ultimate test. We need to be cautiously optimistic, I think, while also staying alert and ready for any bumps in the road.
That sounds like a smart approach. Recognize the good stuff that's been done, but also realize there's always more to do, right? There's no finish line when it comes to this climate resilience thing.
Totally agree. It's an ongoing process, not some destination we reach and then we're done. It takes constant adaptation, constant improvement.
Okay, shifting gears a bit here. We've been talking about those immediate dangers of frostbite and hypothermia, but there's also those bigger social and economic consequences of this freeze to consider. What are some of those less obvious impacts we should be thinking about?
You make a good point. We got to remember that these extreme weather events, they often hit the most vulnerable folks the hardest. The elderly, people experiencing homelessness, folks without proper heating or access to health care, they're the ones who suffer the most.
It's like a reminder that climate change isn't just about the environment, right? It's a social justice issue too.
Couldn't agree more. And the way we respond to these events have to reflect that. We need to ensure everyone has access to warm shelters, healthcare, all those essential things during times like these. It's about looking out for each other.
And what about the economic side of things? I'm thinking about businesses having to close, transportation getting all messed up, the potential for damage to infrastructure. The costs can add up really quickly.
You're absolutely right. These events can really disrupt the economy,
Mhm.
both in the short term and over the long haul. We got to think about how to deal with the immediate damage, but also how to build that long-term economic resilience to these kinds of shocks.
This is a lot to take in. Honestly, it can feel kind of overwhelming.
It's a complex challenge for sure. But I think it's important to remember that we're not helpless. You know, we can take action, we could prepare and adapt, we can build a stronger future, both for ourselves and our communities.
So, what can our listeners do? What are some practical things they can do, both in the short term to get ready for this freeze and then in the long term to build that resilience against these future climate challenges?
That's the question, isn't it? In the short term, it's all about those basic preparedness steps we've been talking about. Make sure your home is properly insulated, stock up on those essential supplies, have a plan for power outages, check on your elderly neighbors, that kind of stuff.
It's like a winter weather checklist.
Exactly. And for the long haul, there are so many ways to get involved in building climate resilience. You can support those organizations that are working on climate adaptation and mitigation. You can speak up for policies that promote clean energy and sustainable infrastructure. And you can make choices in your own life that reduce your carbon footprint.
It's about individual actions, but it's also about coming together as a community, right? We can help each other prepare, we can support the folks who are most vulnerable, and we can work together to create a more resilient future for everyone.
Well said. We're all in this together, and taking action together is crucial.
So this freeze in Texas and Louisiana, it's just one example of all these extreme weather events we're seeing all over the world. Are there other examples that really stick out to you, events that have been particularly impactful or taught us something important about climate change?
Unfortunately, there were way too many. Think about those recent heat waves in Europe and Asia. They were a stark reminder of how dangerous extreme heat can be, especially in cities. And then those devastating floods in Pakistan last year. They really showed how vulnerable developing countries are to climate impacts. These events, they're a serious reality check. They tell us that climate change isn't some distant threat. It's happening right now, and it's affecting real people's lives in huge ways.
It's really tough to see the damage these events are causing to communities all over the world. It definitely underscores how urgent it is to take action. But dwelling on all the doom and gloom doesn't really help anyone. How do we balance that urgency with a message of hope and empowerment?
That's a great point. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, even helpless, when faced with these challenges. But we can't let those feelings paralyze us. We got to remember that every single thing we do, no matter how small it seems, can help build a more sustainable and resilient future.
So what are some of those impactful actions that individuals can take? What can our listeners do to actually make a difference?
Well, there's no magic answer that fits everyone, but there are tons of ways to get involved. Start by learning about climate change and how it impacts us. Talk about it with your friends and family. Support businesses and organizations that are trying to fix the problem. And vote for leaders who prioritize climate action. These are all real steps we can take to make a difference.
I think a lot of people get stuck in that mindset of what can I do? I'm just one person. But you're right, every action matters. And when we all join forces, we can create a powerful force for change.
Absolutely. It's about shifting from that me mindset to a we mindset. We're all part of the solution here. We all have a role to play.
Well said. This deep dive has been pretty eye-opening. We've gone from talking about this freeze in Texas and Louisiana to the bigger picture of how everything's connected globally to these even bigger questions about climate change and what the future holds. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And I think it highlights something super important. These weather events that seem isolated, they're not isolated at all. They're all part of this bigger story of a changing climate. And that story, it's still being written. The choices we make today are going to determine what that story looks like in the future.
It's a powerful thought, isn't it? We're not just watching this happen.
Right.
We're actively shaping the future of our planet. And that's both a big responsibility and an incredible opportunity.
All right, so we've really dug into the immediate impact of this freeze hitting Texas and Louisiana. And we've even touched on those ripple effects, extending beyond those states. But how far do these ripples actually go? It's all connected, right?
Oh, absolutely. What's happening down in Texas and Louisiana, it really highlights how weather, well, it doesn't really care about borders, does it? Think of it like a giant puzzle. This freeze is just one piece in a much bigger, more complicated global weather system. What happens in one part of the world can set off a chain reaction, triggering responses across the whole planet.
So let's talk about those chain reactions. What kind of connections are we seeing between this freeze and other weather events happening around the world? Well, remember we talked about the polar vortex, how it's weakened. That allows all that freezing Arctic air to flow south, bringing these unusual cold temps to North America. But that same phenomenon, it can actually influence weather all over the Northern Hemisphere.
Hold on. So a freeze in Texas could actually be connected to heavier snowfall in Europe or Asia. That's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is when you think about it. Some meteorologists think that this weakened polar vortex could be leading to more frequent and more intense winter storms in those areas. And it's not just limited to winter storms either. It can mess with things like rainfall patterns and temperatures over huge distances.
It really underscores how global climate changes, right? It's not just about these individual events, but about these interconnected patterns that are changing and becoming more intense as the planet warms.
Exactly. This freeze, it's just one piece of the puzzle, and it shows just how urgent it is to tackle climate change on a global scale.
Let's zoom back in on the U.S. for a minute. We've been focused on this freeze in the South, but I know other parts of the country have been dealing with their own extreme weather. Can you kind of paint a picture of what's been happening weather-wise across the U.S.?
Sure. While Texas and Louisiana are getting ready for this freeze, we've seen a bunch of powerful winter storms hit the Midwest and Northeast. We're talking heavy snow, treacherous ice, even blizzard conditions in some areas. It's caused major travel disruptions, power outages, the whole 9 yards.
I saw some pictures online, cars buried in snowdrifts, people digging themselves out of their homes. It looked like a scene from a movie. I bet it's rough dealing with those conditions.
It's been a tough winter for a lot of folks across the country, that's for sure. And these storms, along with the freeze down south, they've really put a strain on our emergency response systems and infrastructure.
It's a good reminder of how important being prepared is, for individuals and for communities as a whole.
I couldn't agree more. We got to be ready for anything Mother Nature throws at us. That means having a plan, stocking up on those essentials, and knowing how to stay safe during extreme weather.
We've talked a lot about those immediate impacts, but what about the long-term stuff? How might these increasingly frequent and intense weather events change our communities and how we live in the years to come? What kind of world are we headed towards?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, we're just starting to understand the answers. But one thing's clear. We have to adapt. We have to rethink how we design our cities, our infrastructure, our agriculture, even our economies. We have to move from just reacting to these events to being more proactive, more resilient.
So it's not just about riding out the storm. It's about fundamentally changing how we live and how we interact with the environment, right? That sounds like a pretty huge task.
Sure. It is a Massive challenge, no doubt. But it's also a chance to do things differently, to build stronger, more connected communities. It's an opportunity to create a world that's better equipped to handle the impacts of climate change. We have the power to shape our own future.
This deep dive has taken us on quite a ride. From the immediate impact of this freeze in Texas and Louisiana, to the way global weather patterns are all connected, to those bigger questions about climate change and the kind of future we're creating.
It's been a really fascinating conversation, and it really highlights how we're all connected, right? The choices we're making today are shaping the world of tomorrow.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the crazy world of weather and all that comes with it. We hope you learned something new, maybe saw things from a different angle, and maybe even feel a little bit inspired to do something. Because every little thing we do, it all adds up to a more sustainable and resilient future. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged, folks. Because this conversation, it's far from over.